Hi, everyone. I think that it's time to move to the keynote lecture, the final part of this conference. I see that we are 50 people attending now, so that means that this kind of Zoom conference does work, which is a good news in my view. So I'm really thrilled to introduce and then to try to respond to our guest, Richard Elliott, who will be talking in a minute about some crucial issues of this conference, including the relationship with the present. Actually, as you might have already seen, his talk is entitled Revisiting Old Hounds in a Time of Lockdown, Holiday Records, Virtuality, and the Nostalgia Gap. So we are very much into the current global situation here as it relates to the past. So before giving him the floor, I would like to say briefly that Richard is a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle, and he has written several books, mostly on popular music, but his last is The Sound of Nonsense, which deals very much with literature. I don't have the time to go into details, but it looks like a truly fascinating book, which relates, of course, to the notion of nonsense and perhaps in some mysterious ways to the notion of nostalgia itself, but that's only a guess. What I can say is that I think the themes Richard will be addressing today are like a thread of nostalgia running to several of his main works, starting with his 2010 book, Fado and the Place of Longing, a book to which he will be referring to, but also I think that there are common themes in the late voice as well, since it deals with the notions of aging and longing and nostalgia, these three things being on the same time very different, as he makes a case in the book itself. And as he says in the abstract you might have seen, this is what today's talk is also related to an article he published a few years ago about holiday record songs and the notion of not being in the places which are mentioned, alluded, evoked in the music you're listening to. And so I think that this thread is very much connected to what we have been through these last months globally and even in this conference. By the way, I remember that Lola, when she opened the Nostalgia Cafe, as she called it, on Friday for the panelists and the participants, she said something like that we should be having dinner together rather than being talking on Zoom, and it immediately triggered in me a kind of nostalgia for this dinner that never happened in the first place. So, well, it's time to welcome Richard for this talk we were so much looking forward to. And so, Richard, the floor is yours. Please be welcome.
Thank you very much, Esteban. And thank you to Lola and the rest of the conference organizing team for inviting me to speak today, and to all the speakers for the wonderful papers that we've been hearing over the last few days. I will be playing a few musical examples later in the presentation. I think there are varying sound quality, so I will mention them as they come up, but it may just be the case that anyone listening on headphones may want to just put the volume down a little bit when those examples come up. So I've titled this presentation, Revisiting Old Haunts in a Time of Lockdown. The first old haunt I'm revisiting here is Lisbon. It's a city I've lived in and visited regularly over the last 2 decades, but which I've been prevented from visiting in recent months. As well as regular visits to family in Portugal, I also visit the country for professional reasons. My most recent visits were in September 2019 and January 2020 for a current research project, and I was due to return this month for a conference and to conduct further research. That conference has been cancelled and the research interrupted by COVID-19, creating a gap of the kind that is at the heart of this presentation, a gap that brings a sense of longing, frustration, and nostalgia. My forced distance from Lisbon this summer has made the city once more into what I once termed the place of longing. Which brings me to another old haunt that I'm revisiting here, the book Fado and the Place of Longing, Loss, Memory and the City, published 10 years ago and to which I will make occasional reference during this talk. Another old haunt is also a publication mentioned by Esteban, an article on holiday records published in 2014 in a special issue of the journal Volume on popular music and nostalgia. In that article, I argued that the representation of remembered or imagined spaces through the genre I call holiday records provided useful ways of reflecting on the nostalgia gap that exists between present and past, between here and elsewhere, and between representations and what they represent. These records, mostly dating from the 1950s to the 1970s, but never quite extinct as a genre, promised to reduce temporal and spatial gaps for their listeners by providing them with virtual trips to faraway places. In 2020, with so much of the world experiencing a forced turn to virtual connections, this topic started to resonate in new ways for me. In this talk, I will use my reflection on holiday records and the nostalgia gap as a starting point for asking whether broader questions of nostalgia, distance, and the virtual. Thinking of music as a form of virtuality, I want to ask questions about the virtual as the dream of the future and the past, as well as a forced reality of the present. As we long for a return to the real, does music's virtual conjuring offer a promise or escape, or a reminder of our restrictions? How do we understand music's summoning and destruction of presence and absence? While researching my book on the Fado music of Lisbon, I became increasingly interested in the ways in which Fado had been marketed to international audiences, particularly in the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st. I discovered many records from the late 1950s and 1960s, which featured Fado music in versions that represented a range of authenticities. By this, I mean that there were some recordings that featured Fado singers and instrumentalists from the local community singing songs which maintained a strong connection to Fado traditions. And there were others which featured quite different takes on Fado, often orchestral arrangements more suited to an international, easy listening style pioneered by arrangers such as Mantovani, Georges Mellecrino, and Bert Kempfert. What connected them all was the attempt to capture something of the ambience of Lisbon as marketed to tourists in search of sonic souvenirs or as advertisements of the Portuguese capital for those who had yet to venture there. I was also interested in the way in which toponymic Fado songs, that is, songs that make explicit reference to places, were used as representations of Portuguese cities. Two of the most famous were Lisboa Antiga, which is featured on countless albums, and Coimbra, which became better known in an English language version as April in Portugal. A review in a 1965 edition of Gramophone magazine for the Holiday in Portugal record related it to the holiday madness of that year, suggesting it would be popular with returning holidaymakers, but deserved attention in its own right. This holiday madness was presumably connected to the many other holiday records that emerged at this time, whether these were compilations released as souvenirs or albums by established international artists conceptualized via a travel theme. These holiday records acted as a transcribed experience, souvenirs of the foreign holidays being taken by increasing number of people in the 1960s. But they also acted as prescribed experiences, in that they offered armchair travelers the pretense of traveling far and wide and highlighted music's ability to provide virtual experiences. Often, such albums would present themselves as tourist itineraries, the rear cover of Frank Sinatra's Come Fly With Me, depicted a flight plan with a flight log and listed the pilots as Sinatra, Billy May, and Nelson Riddle. Tony Bennett's If I Ruled the World showed a table on the rear jacket listing departures, remarks, destinations, and time. The front cover of Bing Crosby's Holiday in Europe was adorned with postcard-style motifs of each country, while the liner notes on the rear claimed that Crosby's unique charm dismisses the barriers of language, culture, and geography with casual aplomb. The liner notes to George Melacrino's Lisbon at Twilight, written by the travel editor of Esquire magazine for an American audience, emphasized the benefit provided for the listener by observing that the record will cost approximately $450 less than the round-trip economy class airfare between New York and Lisbon. These two Mantovani albums include typical holiday record themes, from the choice of music to the aesthetics based on postcard motifs and tourist brochures. Continental Encores was a particularly lavish affair, a genuine album in that its gatefold cover incorporated an 8-page booklet with color photos of European tourist destinations, complete with glamorous young tourist couples, and gushing notes describing the journey and sound contained on the record. The combination of music and recording technology, we are told, can bring Europe into our living rooms and lead you gently by the ear to familiar or imagined places. Like the use of glamorous locations in films of the period, this type of holiday album presented itself above all as an account of something that other, more sophisticated people were doing, or that gifted musicians could make you believe you could do. These were other people's holiday albums, which listeners were invited to peruse and to imagine being a part of. In place of souvenirs, such records provide a sense of imaginative longing. As Edward Casey once observed, nostalgia has as much, or perhaps more, to do with imagination as it does with memory anyway, and therefore employs invention and a priori speculation rather than accurate documentary history. In this way, holiday records can be connected to contemporaneous genres such as mood music, easy listening, and exotica, the kinds of music entertainingly discussed by Joseph Lanza in his 1994 book, Elevator Music. However, as I put it in my 2014 article, where exotica indexes impossible fantasies beyond the borders of the wildest Orientalism, holiday records showcase reachable but romanticized destinations, even as they often settle for armchair representation. Where exotica focuses on the fantasy of adventure and the nostalgically misremembered dangers of elsewhere, the holiday record trades in the possibilities of leisurely travel and tourism and in cultural misrepresentations of a more modest kind. Holiday records of this kind have not received as much attention as exotica, but they are covered in Lanza's book, in the edited collection Widening the Horizon, and more extensively in publications by John Connell and Chris Gibson on music and tourism. Connell and Gibson write about these records as examples of virtual tourism, drawing much of their evidence from the covers and liner notes that accompany them. And this focus on the visual and the textual is one that I've also been drawn to. However, it's important to think about the music contained in the records too, and the ways in which the music further establishes the nostalgia gap. This is why I structured my discussion of holiday records in both my Fado book and my 2014 article around a distinction between the claims to authenticity made by the promoters of the records and the music contained within them, measuring the gap between the authentic and the inauthentic. One of the examples that I used was the Bert Kempfert album, April in Portugal, from 1958. As well as comparing Kempfert's album to examples of genuine Portuguese fado, I compared it to the contemporaneous Miles Davis album, Sketches of Spain, noting how Davis was granted an authenticity in his take on flamenco, and how it might be difficult to grant the same to Kempfert. In the 2014 article, my commitment to the sounds of the music was maintained by structuring the article around a study of the song Coimbra, which began life as a song associated with the great fado star Amália Rodrigues, then took on a new life as a French song called Avril au Portugal, before becoming one of the great hits of the mid-1950s as April in Portugal. And I'm going to play a taste now of the international career of the song. So this is a medley of around 2.5 minutes.
Coimbra é uma lição de sonho e tradição, o lento é uma canção e a lua a faculdade. O livro é uma mulher, só passa quem souber e aprende-se a dizer saudade. Avril au Portugal, à deux filiales, la Bastille on a vu, le ciel est plus debout, pour un sentimental, l'amour est... Whispering serenade comes softly through the night, and whispers of a lover when the stars are bright. I found my April dream in Portugal with you, when we discovered romance like I never knew.
So I won't go into the details of all those different versions at the moment, although I'm happy to pick that up later if it's of interest. In following the itinerary of this song, it was possible to trace a number of distancing moments. Firstly, there was the distance between the romanticized representation of the city of Coimbra, as depicted in the song, and the real and imaginary city being represented. Secondly, there was the distance between the original Coimbra and the classic fado, or classic fado music rather, especially Lisbon fado, a gap which was in many ways repaired or reduced later as the song became increasingly connected to Amália, fado's biggest star. Thirdly, there were the subsequent gaps opened up between Portuguese language song and its French and English versions and other versions as well, which I should point out contained newly written lyrics rather than translations of the original. Fourthly, there were further gaps opened up as the song became a staple of easy listening and holiday-themed albums in mostly instrumental orchestral versions. Each new version seemed to take the song further away from its association with Coimbra fado. Again, this led to issues of authenticity and authentication. At what point, if any, was this ever a realistic depiction of a city? At what point was it a fado? And while I'm interested in the gap between the real and the represented and between the real and the virtual, I'm not wanting to argue that representation or virtuality are somehow inauthentic experiences. They are as real as anything else. Holiday records are real. The effects they produce are real. They are mediators between different kinds or qualities of experience, and I'm not wishing to valorize any one of those experiences over the other. I'm more interested here in what these objects do and what they claim to do. In thinking about what holiday records do, I find myself drawn to the metaphor of the postcard. Certainly, as examples of visual and textual representation, the comparison seems apt. Postcards do several things. They act as mediators between senders and receivers. They act as a promotion of place. They act as a representation of place, inevitably reduced, essentialized, sometimes ironic and knowing, at times sophisticated, at other times cheap and tacky. The kind of postcard one chooses to send to family or friends says as much about the sender and receiver as it does about the place being represented on the front and the experience being reported on the rear. Postcards may be bought for oneself, of course, in which case they play the role of souvenir. They are objects which connect the here and now of buying and sending to the then and there of receiving or remembering. They are objects purchased in the knowledge of a future anteriority, a moment in which the present will have been reported or recalled. They are both prescriptive and transcriptive. They are prescribed because a network of actors, photographers, illustrators, designers, manufacturers, printers, distributors, retailers, has anticipated the need for the purchase, a need, of course, saturated in ritual and precedent. And also because the postcard buyer has anticipated buying the postcard as part of their traveling experience. Postcards are transcribed because the same network of actors has attempted to get something of a place and an experience down on paper. It has committed itself to an act of documentary. Postcards imagine remembering. Holiday records are comparable, it seems to me, and I'm struck by how many variations on a theme there are, just as with postcards. There are attempts at sophistication, as in some of the Melachrino and Mantovani albums, and there are examples which appear quite tawdry. This may sometimes relate to the extent to which the album is marketed as an artist-centered or an activity-centered one. For example, there are multiple versions of Portuguese holiday music arranged by the Basque-born bandleader Segundo Galarza, who spent most of his career in Portugal. The album Holiday in Portugal contains instrumental versions of several fados, including the ubiquitous Lisboa Antiga and Coimbra. Vocals are removed from these arrangements, we are told, because visitors might find them somewhat strange in their language and emotional intensity. For the braver soul or the connoisseur, vocal versions of the same tracks are made available on an album called Fadista's Choice. The instrumental versions are also issued on a collection called Música de Portugal, which removes reference to Galarza and the Portuguese guitarist Jorge Fontes from the cover in favor of a recreation of a Portuguese postcard. The album Holidays in Portugal, meanwhile, contains some of the same songs, but is a distinct collection, aiming for the cheap and cheerful postcard aesthetic. In comparing records and postcards, I'm also thinking of the work published on memory and nostalgia by Michael Pickering and Emily Keatley. For example, their excellent books on the mnemonic imagination and its creative uses of nostalgia, and their study of photographs and sound recordings as technologies of memory. The brochure is another example or another metaphor for considering the holiday record. Holiday brochures, of course, attempt to portray the holiday experience and to paint places in the best possible light. The Mantovani album Continental Encores is one example. A slightly more modest one, perhaps, is this album featuring the fado singer Lydia Ribeiro, which was privately released by the Hotel Estoril Sol and Casino Estoril as a way of promoting their businesses, as well as that of another hotel in Lisbon. These objects are anachronisms now, of course, only of interest to a niche group of collectors. We're far enough removed from the moment of production and reception that it can be hard to discover what the producers of these records intended, how the records were received, and what people actually did with them. It is hard to find first-hand accounts or do ethnographic work on this now. One of the reasons that I find so many of these records in charity shops and house clearance auctions is that their original purchasers were either no longer interested in them or, more likely, are no longer with us. The records themselves are exhausted commodities, to use Will Straw's term. What has become of these records, or what have they been replaced with? Well, Connell and Gibson traced the processes of virtual tourism and vicarious journeys from the holiday records of the 1960s to ambient and new age records and CDs, and to what became, in the 1980s and 1990s, the genre of world music. As I noted in my Fado book, it was easy to find examples in the world music sections of shops of what passed for holiday records in the early 2000s when I was writing. In this sense, the holiday record never really became extinct. We might look instead at changes in formats. The holiday records of the 1960s were very much part of the vinyl LP boom, where the long-playing format lent itself to grouping songs together via concepts and themes. And this idea was easy to continue in the CD era, as we can see. And in the streaming era in which we now find ourselves, the function has largely been taken up by the playlist. Nostalgia, perhaps, is immune to format, while format is often intimately connected to nostalgia. We can place a nostalgic agenda at the source of sound recording, for example, in the desire to retain the voice for future memories. At the heart of the phonograph, which, let us recall, was imagined by Edison as a dictation and memorial device, is a desire to create and revisit old haunts. With each subsequent development in phonography, we find related desires, ways to summon moods and affects, and to posit journeys to remembered and imagined places. Leonika Boldermann's recent book on musical tourism and topophilia has productively analysed the ways in which people use playlists in services such as Spotify to imagine and plan voyages before travelling, to accompany those trips and then also to recall them later. Music can be like a book or painting, Boldermann writes, something to be pondered over, forming the start of developing elaborate imaginary worlds. However, music experienced in its unfolding over time can also be a tool to set the mood and atmosphere of a place, used more instrumentally to enchant the physical world with that which is not present. Music is about connection and disconnection from the listener's environment. For Boldermann's interviewees, music was used as a tool to literally tune into or out of a landscape. This is important because we often think about music in terms of location, but we should also consider it in terms of dislocation. The dislocative possibilities of music are what allow it to both seem to be about or connected to particular places, while equally detachable from them. Music makes us feel in and out of place. How might we reflect on these issues of virtual travel, distance, and nostalgia gaps in 2020? Recent months have seen travel curtailed, not just tourism, but any travel related to leisure and a significant amount of travel related to labour. Not all of it, of course, and it's worth remembering the reliance that communities have had on public transport for key workers and on the logistics of the food chain and other delivery systems. Travel has not stopped for many, but tourism stopped, and with it we witnessed a shift towards virtual tourism. In the second half of this talk, I'd like to reflect on some examples from recent months of connections between music, sound, absence, and the virtual. On the 21st of March of this year, the British singer-songwriter Billy Bragg released a track called Can't Be There Today. It came with the following information. The coronavirus pandemic is going to affect our lives in ways we've yet to grasp. In the coming months, most of us will be forced to miss family gatherings, starting with Mother's Day, which in the UK falls on the first weekend of isolation. Here's a new song written in the past few days that touches on the emotional cost of this crisis. And I'll just play the start of the lyric video version of that song.
An invite to a wedding that no one can attend, a poster for a show that never happened, 2 tickets for a holiday I can no longer spend, and a gift for Mother's Day I won't be wrapping.
Judging from comments left online, the message of the song resonated with Bragg's listeners beyond the topical specificity of Mother's Day, becoming a broader reflection on a world in which, as the song put it in a later verse, it feels hope has been postponed and plans put on hold. Prospects fade and expectations shatter. The song also led to Bragg's involvement in a virtual fundraising event for Mother's Day in the US, and also surfaced in a cover version by Emily Barker on a digital album released to raise funds for the Save Our Venues campaign. Bragg's song fits into a long tradition of the song as gift. Think of Bernie Taupin and Elton John's Your Song, or Leon Russell's A Song for You. In such songs, we often find the following features and paradoxes. The song as substitute for a physical gift. The gift which is seemingly offered up with no expectation of reciprocity, but which may also be placed on the market as an object of exchange. The song as a personal message, but at least in songs released in the public sphere, available to the world. More pertinent perhaps to the themes I'm exploring here is the idea of the song as substitute for an experience, taking the place of being in another place or being with another person. The gift song defines itself through absence, offering itself as a virtual bridge or mediator. Even if not explicitly toponymic or topophilic, Bragg's song is still what Connell and Gibson would call a vicarious journey. It was written and released amid countless narratives of separation and loss, and also at a time of new vicarious journeys, as stories started to appear on social media of people imagining holiday and travel experiences through dress-up, music, researching information about places they wished to visit. Bragg was also one of the many hundreds of well-known musicians who started regularly filming themselves performing in their homes, or in Bragg's case, outside his home. While music has always taken listeners on journeys, this year we have increasingly been taken on a different kind of journey, not to the imagined lands that musicians summon for us, although there's been some of that, but rather to the places those musicians inhabit. Their rooms, their homes, the venue from which they produce their live streamed performances. And this makes me wonder, will there be a future moment when we yearn to be back in the comforting rooms of our favorite musicians? Will there be a kind of disaster nostalgia associated with the pandemic, akin to those we have witnessed after periods of war? On the 12th of June of this year, the American jazz pianist Brad Mehldau released an album entitled Sweet April 2020, his musical response to the lockdown and the feelings it evoked. Titles of pieces in the suite included Keeping Distance, Stopping, Listening, Hearing, Remembering Before All This, Yearning, and Waiting. All terms that evoke familiar feelings of dislocation, absence, interruption, and nostalgia. The album also includes a version of Billy Joel's New York State of Mind as a toponymic reference that connects the specific to the general. Like many other musical projects released this year, Mehldau is also using the album as a way to raise money for the endangered livelihoods of musicians, with sales of the limited edition physical release being donated to the Jazz Foundation of America's COVID-19 Musicians Emergency Fund. In his accompanying notes to the album, Meldau refers to the dislocation he felt recording in Amsterdam, where he was living with his family, and thinking of New York and other places that he couldn't travel to. He also reflects on the more general themes of the album. His album, like many others this year, reflects on the current predicament and offers itself as a witness statement for now and for the future. As one reviewer writes on the Discogs website, "I really love this rare piece of direct and deeply moving art that will be like a musical time capsule someday when we have all left behind this oppressive COVID-19 era." I want to note again this sense of future anteriority, the potential for a future nostalgia for this distressing moment. Is nostalgia even an appropriate term to use for such future retrospection? In many cases, of course, only time will tell. To offer another example of how the present may contribute to a future sonic archive, I want to briefly revisit Lisbon by turning to the project called The Sounds of Tourism. This is a research project led by Inigo Sanchez Juarez and comprising researchers from universities in Lisbon, Valladolid, and Belfast. The project, in its own words, seeks to explore the impact of tourism on everyday urban public ambiences, with a particular focus on the sonic ambience. It takes the touristification of historic Lisbon neighborhoods, both as a research object and as an analytical lens for investigating the role of sound in the cultural and sensory restructuring of touristified urban spaces in the post-industrial city, end quote. While building on and expanding work that has been done in recent years on the role of music in the city of Lisbon and how certain musical sounds, most notably fado, have become emblematic of the city, the Sounds of Tourism project has also been listening beyond the musical. For example, it has explored the significant increase in the frequency and volume of sounds associated with mass tourism, from aeroplanes flying over the city to the noise created by nightlife activities in the city centre, and particularly its residential areas. It has also tried to unearth the sounds that are being drowned out by all this activity, the sonic signature of the city before and after the arrival of hundreds of thousands of visitors. As with so many other activities, the continued work of the Sounds of Tourism project was severely challenged by the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet this also offered the researchers an opportunity to discover what might otherwise have been very difficult: the sound of the city without tourists. They began to record a series of COVID-19 sound postcards, taking the idea of the sound postcard from an early 20th century media format that combined visual and sonic material to be sent, like a regular postcard, as personal communication from one person to another. The COVID-19 postcards are not quite that. Instead, they are audio-visual records posted online in embedded videos to portray the sounds of the almost silenced city. A city that seems silent, even though it isn't. More accurately, we might say that there has been a recalibration of the sounds that come to the forefront. Some noises of the city continue, as the authors note, for example, the sound of precarious workers. Some are new or newly returned noises, such as the sound of wildlife. This has been a clever response on the part of the Sounds of Tourism team, as the postcard idea retains the tourism theme and connects to the souvenir too. As two of the researchers note in an article for The Conversation, these postcards are building a sound archive that may function in a post-COVID era as a memory of this time, but also as a comparative tool for measuring the noise of the city as it increases again. If it is hard to predict how the present moment will be archived, it is perhaps easier to recognize how the present moment has relied on archives available to us. This year, we have witnessed both a temporary halt to a progress as the pandemic shuts down economies, and after a first panicked halt to everything, an increase in the acceleration of what becomes available to us, at least to those of us who are digitally connected and otherwise relatively secure. those who are able to partake of and even indulge in the massive resources of digitally available culture that suddenly become available. Some archives are being used to specifically revisit old haunts, as in the release by the New York Public Library of The Missing Sounds of New York, which is a newly packaged album of existing archival recordings. Then there are television archives, such as the ones the Portuguese channel RTP Memoria has been collating in recent years under the labels Gramophone, Replay, Retrovisor, and others. One of the clips available is a fascinating early 1960s jazz fado from Segundo Galarza, the arranger of the Fado and Holiday records that we saw earlier. Like other features in the Gramophone series, this was made available online before the COVID-19 pandemic. Seeing it now, however, offers a portal into the national memory in times of increased screen viewing. These clips have also been embedded into other RTP channels, including the TV school channel that replaced in-person lessons during the lockdown in Portugal. Another recent example of the use of archives as substitutes for physical experience is the series of programs shown under the Glastonbury Experience banner on the BBC. This was the BBC's way of dealing with what is often a successful summer broadcast, filmed footage of the Glastonbury Festival as it happens. With this year's festival cancelled due to COVID-19, the normal formula was replaced by presenters introducing archival clips and occasional live, socially distanced performances and interviews from open fields, with the skeletons of the main stages in the background. This attempt at a blended experience of the festival was uncanny at times, but also served as a reminder of how mediated the festival experience is, even in normal years. These archival clips underline how the festival has long been a multiply mediated event, available to television viewers as well as in-person participants. As Fabian Holt has argued, the videoed festival creates anticipation, acts as a locus for remembering, and produces an archive that can be used for future marketing. This year, in the case of the Glastonbury Experience, it was also used as a substitute for the real thing. The live, present in-person experience becomes what is valued, an example of what Holt calls the privileged time of festivals. With its absence this year, we witnessed the longing for physical proximity. The festival has always operated as a kind of utopian space, and occasionally as a dystopian one too, making it a place of longing and an alternative city. One of the archival clips from this year's Glastonbury Experience was Adele's headline set from 2016. Introducing her song, Hometown Glory, she makes a reference to Tottenham, where she was born, but then says, "We all wish that we could just live here, really, don't we? That this could be our hometown." Meaning, of course, the alternative community created at Glastonbury. The Glastonbury Experience was a multiply vicarious experience, relying on a sense of collective memory and nostalgia for previous festival experiences, but also relying on the collective goodwill of a mass television audience to buy into the experience and to join in, whether by sending video clips to be shown on the programme or by commenting on social media. Haunts, postcards, archives, presence and absence. The topics I've covered have a particularly Derridean feel to them. This wasn't my starting intention. It was only something I realized retrospectively as I was assembling the ideas I wished to present. But retrospection is what this has all been about, and perhaps I should not be surprised that Derrida was another old haunt I would end up revisiting. Albeit accidentally. If the ghost of Derrida appears in what I say here, it is an uninvited but a very welcome ghost as far as I'm concerned. Just ahead of what would have been his 90th birthday, there is still much to learn from him about as we approach gaps and nostalgia and the virtual. But this is a late gesture of mine, and I don't wish to dwell on those connections anymore at present. I make no attempt here to try and make more of these connections, really. In wrapping up, I merely wish to highlight the virtual as the dream of the future and the past, and also as a forced reality of our present, as we long for, and perhaps slightly dread, a return to the real. What role does music play in this? Music summons and destroys absence. For musicians, the act of making music is putting something in the world that wasn't there before, but also putting something there that is about to vanish again. Music can be understood as a projection into the world and a retreat from it, a form of evaporation. For listeners, music conjures presence, creates and recreates and fills spaces. And music still does its virtual conjuring. But how do we feel about this when the physical is removed from us and we from it? In returning to the questions I posed at the outset of this talk, I'm very aware that the nostalgia that accompanies our removal from many of the processes of musicking at the moment. This absence creates not only a longing for a very recent past, but also a real gap in terms of the ability of people to make a living, to survive this moment. This affects people in all walks of life, but perhaps the most relevant to my presentation here are those who work in the music and tourism industries. Several of the examples I've mentioned in the second half combine musical examples to bridge distances and make virtual connections, while also attempting to connect their nostalgic modes in some form of action to protect the future of musicians. And here's one brief final example, the first part of a video published by the Music Venue Trust as part of the Let the Music Play campaign.
Do you remember that first gig? Maybe you were dragged there by your mates, or it came at the end of a very long wait. To see that band, and it felt so good to stand shoulder to shoulder with others who understood. Your heart swelled, and you felt accepted for who you were. It gave you the confidence to pick up that pen, that mic, or that guitar. And our towns and cities are peppered with these special places, amazing hidden spaces tucked high above pubs, or nested down twisty stairs, venues with posters on the wall that say, "It's okay, be you, do what you want with your hair." What might look like just a door on the street is actually a portal to a cathedral, elastic with dreams.
So in this video, nostalgia is weaponized, turned into a rhetorical, emotional tool to focus attention on policies needed to safeguard the live music industry. Here again is an example of the dual-faced nature of nostalgia, as it trades on the affect of the past to imagine a future that will have been. In closing, I'd like to thank Lola and the conference committee again for the opportunity to speak at this wonderful event. I hope that it will not be long before we can all meet in person, or at least continue our virtual conversations about the topics that we've been sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. I cannot say anything else to start the conversation than a heartfelt thank you for this incredibly thought-provoking talk, and also a moving talk. And I stress the word moving, because we are in such a weird situation in which we cannot move at all. And I think that you managed to address in 45 minutes so many different issues, so many things that just complicate the simple idea that there is something like the past followed by the present and then eventually by the future, that it's a kind of tour de force at some level, because I think that we have just started to think about what's going on with this pandemic thing in our lives and in everybody's lives. And I think that one of the most striking, at least to me, experiences is the fact that time and space are, as you use the word, dislocated, right? And since you quoted Derrida at the end, I remembered his wonderful comment in Spectres of Marx about Hamlet's sentence, time is out of joint. And I think that's exactly, or it's kind of central to what we are experiencing worldwide right now. So I think that what you just said is such a basis to start a conversation that will surely go on for a long time. So thank you for that. So I'm supposed to respond rather than to chair. So of course, I'm sure there will be questions. There are already some of them. And but I'll try to do my best to try to respond to some of the issues you raised. So in a few minutes, well, what strikes me most is what I just underscored, this idea of time and space being bound by very complex relationship, with definitely don't confound themselves with the notion of nostalgia being a relationship with the past that has been lost. I mean, that can be a kind of minimal definition, but it's just the start of the whole conversation, and it's definitely not the end. And it's usually what happens in good conferences is that the more you hear, the more you say at the end, but what is nostalgia after all at the end? And so that's one of the reasons I think you were right in saying that nostalgia might not be the appropriate term for all of the kind of things we are dealing with, but it still is like a way of asking things about how time and space are related and how this normal relationship between time and space are interrupted or at least seriously disturbed right now. By the way, I listened in the radio a few days ago that contrary to the common sense notion that streaming platforms were doing incredibly well during lockdowns, the contrary was true, because actually most people listen to music when they move. I mean, in metros and buses and so on. And when you or others are at home, they do that less often and not more. And so that was a counterintuitive remark. Of course, there would be lots of empirical research to do with that, how exactly it worked and how it is working right now, since I must remind everyone that the lockdown, of course, are going on in many places in the world. We are just in the middle of the whole pandemic and definitely not after that, even if in France, for instance, we have a temporary feeling that, well, we can already start to think of at least the confinement phases, as they call it here, as something that happened between March and June. We will see what the future will bring. But anyway, I want to actually, I have a question for you, Richard, that is, could you tell us more about the temporality, the inner temporality of what is usually described as a feeling of nostalgia? What I mean by that is that I have two contradictory images about how it works, I mean, at a very interior level, even somatic level. I have this notion, this impression that nostalgia is something very slow, something that can go on with, I don't know, can spread over time, and we can be in a mood, in a nostalgic mood, as a kind of slowing down our emotions and being slowly invaded by this presence of an absence. And then I have the contrary impression, which is the idea that nostalgia comes as a pang, as a shock, as something that destabilizes even your body. I mean, you are surely familiar with the 17th and even 18th centuries narratives about this topical situation where the Swiss mercenaries listened to the song The Rang des Vaches and then immediately ran home because they couldn't stand the nostalgia, and that's one of the alleged origins of the term. In that particular case, nostalgia is a sudden thing. It's like kind of a heart attack, something that creeps your whole body, paralyzes it, and forces you to do something that rationally is against your best interests. And so there are these two contrasted ways of thinking the very notion of time being involved in the feeling of nostalgia. And I bring this up because I heard, and I don't have a serious empirical observation on that, but the lockdown experience was very contradictory also at that level. People saying, well, I have more time to do this and listen to music, for instance, and I can catch up with all those books I wanted to read and so on and so forth. And also the contrary idea that you don't have the time to do all the stuff you have to do because you're dealing with, I mean, a mess of normal temporalities, even at a domestic level. And so I wonder if there is anything that can be said at all about the inner temporality of nostalgia. And I'm thinking about your metaphor of the postcard, because a postcard is, well, it's kind of a snapshot. I mean, you look at it and there is no time involved, but you can also put it on the wall and then you see it all day long if you wish, even if you're not focusing on it. So the postcard is itself very unstable, and you are using it as a metaphor for something that encapsulates time in a very precise way. By the way, I had not much time to look at it with precision, but the sonic postcards, the sound postcards, are actually like clips adapted to the standard duration of YouTube clips, namely 4 to 5 minutes. And that goes as a postcard, but of course, it's completely arbitrary to make a cut of 5 minutes rather than 5 seconds or 5 hours. And so the whole notion of time being encapsulated in sound is very much fluid itself, and maybe it will change as we think of the times we spend listening to music under lockdown. On the other hand, most of people still practice the 3-minute standard of songs being a capsule rather stable as far as time is concerned. So I don't know, it's not very clear as a question, I'm afraid, but still it's a kind of palette of interrogations that came to my mind while I listened to your talk. So before giving you the floor again to try perhaps to address some of these issues, I don't resist the pleasure or the pang of whatever to share my favorite quotation on nostalgia, which is by Walter Benjamin, and he writes it in Berlin Childhood around 1900, and he says, "Several times in my life, I had already experienced the process of inoculation as something salutary. In this situation, he's writing in exile, and so he has this nostalgia of Berlin in 1900. In this situation, too, I resolved to follow suit, and I deliberately called to mind those images which in exile are most apt to waken homesickness, images of childhood. My assumption was that the feeling of longing would no more gain mastery over my spirit than a vaccine does over a healthy body." Of course, what strikes me today in this beautiful quotation is the notion of nostalgia being itself like a kind of vaccine. I mean, a kind of strategy to deal with loss and disease and absences. And so that might be or not one of the reasons we indulge in nostalgic practices, such as listening to music the way you beautifully showed us. So, well, that's what I can think of as a kind of response for now. So I don't know, maybe you might take some minutes to follow up. And anyway, there are other questions waiting for you. Thank you again for this talk.
Okay, thank you so much, Esteban. That was a very rich response, and there's a lot in there. So I look forward to revisiting that when I have a bit more time to process all the things that you said. But I think I'll pick up maybe on one of the first things you said and one of the last things, if that's okay. Very much so. That quote that you pulled from Derrida, which of course he pulls from Shakespeare, of the time being out of joint, I think is so apt at the moment. And I hope my sort of throwing Derrida in right at the end of my conclusion, I hope it wasn't too tokenistic for everyone. But as I say, I really didn't start putting this paper together with Derrida in mind. But then as I was thinking about postcards and archives, and I just couldn't help but think, oh, well, hang on, there's someone who's written so many thousands of words about all of these topics, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't at least mention him. So I think that idea of being of time being out of joint is a very, very important one at the moment. I don't think we are, and of course, as you rightly said, I mean, you know, different communities around the world are at very different stages of dealing with, you know, what we've had to deal with this year with this pandemic, which is an ongoing and worsening situation. So there are many other ways in which time is out of joint. You know, the times of different countries are also out of joint with each other as well. And I think that, you know, for all of us, really, I don't think we're anywhere near to processing what we've been experiencing this year. I think, you know, we've been trying to make sense of it as we go along, trying to survive, trying to do what we can. But its absolute sort of relentless continuity means that there's never really been very much time to reflect and to think about what it has been. And so that moment of future anteriority, which I referenced several times in the talk, is still a very long way off. It's going to be a long time before we will know what will have been and what we will have been through. So that was just one thing really on the out of jointness of it all. But I think that also connects to this other thing, which I guess you bring up through mentioning Benjamin and through some of the other things that you said, which is this process of processing. And I think that's really important as well, that we think of, you know, nostalgia as a way of processing things. And you're right, it is both that very kind of sudden feeling that can attack us and render us you know, immobile, you know, and be an interruption in precisely the way that so many things have been interrupted this year. And it's also something that we can try to gain some kind of control over. I think my favorite example, the one I always find myself going back to here, is Proust, and the idea that that sudden stabbing nostalgia, the involuntary memory, as he refers to it, that comes with tasting the Madeleine, is also the thing that leads the person who experiences it to then try to make sense of that by taking control of the nostalgia. So it is both of those things that you mentioned. It is both the thing that attacks us very suddenly, to which we have no control over whatsoever, and the thing which we then perhaps try to take control over through particular processes. So in Proust's case, the process of writing à la recherche du temps perdu, that is the process, the very, very lengthy and detailed working through of how to deal with that very sudden momentary nostalgia. And yes, I think we do use music for that. I think it's a way in which we can kind of safely engage with those experiences that we've felt. And I think, you know, the other thing I was just trying to bring out, it relates both to the holiday records, but also to what I was referring to at the end there, is the kind of weaponizing of nostalgia, the way in which nostalgia can be used for other purposes as well. So the way in which there's almost this sense in which we know that, you know, we share versions of this nostalgic mode, and that it's something that can be tapped into and used. And of course, we know, I mean, I think most people at this conference are aware that the reduction of nostalgia to an always conservative and negatively thought of experience is a rather simplistic way in which nostalgia is dealt with. In not only in the mainstream media, but often in you know, in a lot of scholarship as well. I think what's wonderful about the papers in this conference is that you know, people are very aware of the subtleties and the nuances of nostalgia and how it can be many things and how it can be instrumentalized perhaps in different ways. So I think I was just wanting to kind of tease that out, that kind of way in which nostalgia is almost this thing that we know can have an affect, and then we can kind of use that for various different purposes to try and deal with situations such as the one that we're in at the moment, a situation of interruption and confusion and considerable anxiety.
Thank you so much, Richard. I would like to listen more. You can go on, I mean, as far as I am concerned, but we are running out of time. On the other hand, Lola, you are perhaps the best person to decide whether we do what we did for the other panels. Namely, I can try to start picking up questions from the many responses that Richard's talk engendered, but maybe we could just show up and talk, right? Because after all,
yes. I was going to say, let's open up the floor for questions from everyone, and we can have a joint conversations, all of us together. I was going to say, well, first of all, thank you, Richard, so much for a really rich and dense and evocative and actually therapeutic talk as well.
First question, which was Andre Daniel, and was a question about eventual differences between records for British audience differing from those for American and French audiences. How was there any diversity of the holiday records from one country to another? That was one of the first questions. And I also read the following one by John van der Weert. One point I observe is this nostalgia for moments that some have taken for granted and or not cherished. I was wondering, after we emerge from this forced hibernation from live performance, if audiences will grow as a result of having our choice to attend or not attend taken away, and only having sonic experience of music available for us. I mean, there are very interesting questions and there are lots of them, but if we address them, I'm afraid we won't have any more time for a roundtable, properly speaking. But at least, Richard, you can perhaps answer to those 2 points. I mean, about general difference.
Yes, yes. I also don't want to hold up the round table, but in terms of that first question about holiday records, I'm not sure that I know enough yet about that, and that's something I'd really like to find out more about. Certainly, I omitted one paragraph from this presentation just for time purposes, which was a little bit of background into how I started getting very interested in these. And it really was, it was two things coming together, really. One is that it was partly doing this research sometimes from a distance on Portuguese fado music while I was based at a university in the UK, and also at the same time visiting a lot of charity shops or thrift shops, whatever. They have different names in different countries, but basically places where you can get very cheap, records and books and clothes and things, and finding lots of these records and noting this representation initially of Portuguese music and kind of versions of fados. And then I started getting interested in that more generally as I started noticing that the same songs appeared on nearly all of these records. So I've focused on the Portuguese ones, Lisboa Antiga and Coimbra, but you will also find that often the same German songs, the same French songs, the same Italian songs, the same Spanish songs will tend to crop up as well. So I guess collecting these in a European context, I've been mostly aware of a very kind of European set of songs that crop up on the records. But I was also interested, for example, in that that album by Melocrino, which was clearly marketed at an American audience, even though the music was recorded in the UK. But what I don't know about, and I would really like to find out more about, is the versions of these musics, these albums in other countries. And I've seen a little bit of that, but not enough to really draw conclusions on now. But it strikes me that there was a kind of international repertoire of, you know, these kinds of romantic place-based, toponymic, if you like, place-based recordings going around, particularly in the 50s and 60s. In terms of the other point about the live music, yeah, there are many things I think that have occurred during lockdown, including things like this, like the conference that we have at the moment, where, you know, people are starting to think, well, actually, you know, as if and when we start moving back to a normality that was more like it was before, will we go back to all of those things? You know, in the case of things like conferences, there seems to be, you know, a sense of, well, maybe, you know, given other concerns around accessibility and the cost of travel and ecological issues, you know, maybe now that we've all been forced to practice and put into practice this virtual alternative, then, you know, we may carry on doing that. Live music, it seems to me, doesn't quite fall into that category, in that it's been really fascinating to see how people have responded to the lack of physical, present in-person live music. And yet it seems to me that the live music experience, there's still such a strong desire, I think, for physical proximity, not just for people to be in physical proximity to the musicians, but also to each other, and to that kind of very difficult to recreate atmosphere that comes with being in a venue with people around you. So I think that, you know, that's something that, that we will see a desire to return to as far as possible.
That Claire Lanchbury raised an important point about diasporic cultural production, and on one side, and lockdown songs on the other. Would, if I interpret a little bit what she's saying, is there any connection between, yeah, diasporic cultural productions and what is going out of the lockdown experiences, namely as if we were exiles in our own homes or something like that? I mean, I just read it. I wonder if there is a productive connection to explore with diasporic cultural production and the lockdown songs, as a sense of housebound and voluntary dislocation, or a shared affect, if nothing else.
Yes, yes, I'm sure there is. I mean, I think, I guess the connection I was trying to draw here in the first and the second half of the paper was this idea, which is a very old idea, of music being used as a way of transporting people to other places. I think what was interesting with the lockdown, I suppose I tried to touch on different types of examples. I mean, there are lockdown songs like the Billy Bragg song, which is clearly trying to express the emotion of dislocation. And in that sense, I think, you know, that idea of a shared affect is very important there. I think it's the idea that that the musician's role, or the songwriter's role in that instance, is as it often is, to become the voice, the collective voice, if you like, or the voice that speaks for the collective, and to encapsulate a sense of that collective affect, that collective affective feeling. And of course, the extent to which that's successful or not can generally be measured, I suppose, in the way that people then respond to that. So we see these kind of feedback loops emerging, particularly through social media, as people sort of start to respond to what musicians are, these kind of lockdown songs, if you like, or gift songs. And that kind of develops a sense in which those songs take on a life of their own. And that's one of the other connections, which perhaps I maybe I didn't draw out enough, is the sense in which songs, I'm interested in songs how songs have a certain agency to them. So, for example, one of the things that I wanted to make the point on with the holiday records was that it's commonplace for us to say that a particular piece of music serves a nostalgic purpose by taking us back to a place and time. But I think it's also worth considering how the original piece of music is already distanced from the experience it's representing, just by being a representation. So we often say, what was I nostalgic for when I heard that piece of music? But I think it's also interesting to ask, what's the piece of music nostalgic for as well? And that might sound silly because it seems to be granting music a kind of agency, which might be a little bit odd. But I don't think it is silly. I think that one of the things I'm trying to grapple with is what people do is only ever temporary and contingent anyway, just like the nostalgic moment is. So it's a moment. And the object, in a way, is the thing that endures and that allows for these other processes. So I never really want to dismiss the object itself, in this case, the song. So, in what have been called evocative objects, for example, I was interested there in the objects themselves, as in the evocation. And paying attention to those objects means that you have to ask questions about what they are and what they're represented at different times. And you have to take their biographies and their itineraries seriously. So one of the things I would be interested in here, I suppose, although it might be difficult to track, is the itineraries that these songs take on, the different meanings that they take on for different people and at different times. So I don't know if that addresses that question or not, but it's kind of one of the things I'm hearing in that question.
Thank you so much. The following question on the list is an interesting question about forgetting. Written down by Yuko Azaba. No, Lola, don't disappear, please. Remind me.
I thought there's no point in being on camera while you answer the question, but maybe perhaps Richard, you could answer that one. And then there was an interesting comment too, which I liked about music, and we could even say art generally, I suppose, as a short-term vaccine. I don't know about the short-term. I wish it were a long-term vaccine.
Well,
but there's this question of you touched on briefly about music, and sometimes it's also discussed as anti-music, in that it's a vaccine that makes you appreciate music, proper music. So I don't know if you can see a link, or whether there's no link whatsoever between ambient and vaccines and music as a short-term vaccine, as we are waiting for the long-awaited COVID vaccine.
I haven't really thought of music as a vaccine. In work I've been doing over the last few years, I've actually been thinking of music, particularly songs, as a virus. And that's something that I've been presenting work on in recent years. I feel I may need to slightly reframe that after this year. But I'm kind of interested in the viral aspects of music as much as anything, and in the way in which songs take on the kind of agency I was trying to make reference to just now, in a way in which they actually kind of live beyond us mere human hosts that contain them for certain times. But I suppose if a song can be a virus, then it can also be a vaccine as well. Whether it's a vaccine that always works is another question. Personally, in my own listening, I know that there are songs or pieces of music that work effectively as repeated vaccines, no matter how many times I've listened to them. In other words, one of the things I'm interested in doing, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is instrumentalizing, nostalgia, or trying to take control of nostalgia and other feelings by trying to cure them with music. In other words, to sort of, bathe, if you like, in the affective qualities of music, and not to necessarily see that as a problem, but to actually see that as a cure. Rather than this is one of my problems when nostalgia gets dismissed so easily and so quickly and in such a reductive way as always a problem, as always something that seems to signify a problem with the nostalgic subject. I never quite understand this, really. I think that nostalgia can also be a cure, and it can be something that we can learn to control, if you like, or to use to our own purposes. So that's probably about the extent to which I can think of music as a vaccine at the moment, but it's a fascinating question to consider.
There's also a point to be made about some music being antiviral. I remember a talk about this in a conference in Lisbon, actually, in 2017, I think. The name of the speaker unfortunately escapes me, but he was making a point of there being a world within YouTube of antiviral music. And the day before yesterday, we heard about vaporwave and we were all asking Ali for links. Can we please listen to that Beirut vaporwave that most of us, or at least me, we've not heard of before, or we haven't heard the actual tracks? And he was saying, well, this is music that's released in antiviral environments where it's not so easy to access. And then going back to YouTube, I was also thinking that I don't remember the exact figures, but I remember once reading how many minutes, or actually how many hours or even days of footage are uploaded to YouTube daily, that we can't catch up even in a lifetime. So that's actually quite anti-nostalgic. I was thinking that during lockdown, TVs had no new shows to broadcast, and we've been watching, well, I haven't, but some people have been watching old football games, old concerts, even old news shows, and that's very nostalgic. Here in Spain, we've got the Nodo from the times of Franco, and they've been playing those time and time again, and it's the ultimate nostalgic, restorative nostalgic place to go for us in Spain. And I was thinking that YouTube is probably the most anti-nostalgic, in that there's no time to catch up, and there's such a flow of new things that even this sort of lockdown wouldn't allow us to even watch back all of the content that has been created. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I mean all the archives that suddenly became made available. I mean, we were already drowning in archives pre-COVID, but particularly during COVID, all of this digital material that became made available, at least to those who had the means to access it, which of course is not everyone. It seemed to have caused among some people a sense of anxiety, a sense that. Yeah, precisely like you said, there's absolutely no way you could ever keep up with all of it, or even access just the stuff that you thought would be of interest to you. And of course, this that background of a kind of ubiquity of material also lies behind, I think, a lot of the theorists that some of the presenters in the conference have been drawing on, whether that's Andreas Huyssen's work, or or even in the background of some of Svetlana Boym's work. And certainly in Pierre Nora and some of the other people who've been mentioned, that sense in which, in a world in which there's just so much stuff, you know, it can be difficult to think about nostalgia and what it is we actually, you know, attach ourselves to. And yet I think in everyone's personal narratives, we know that there are those things that we can return to, and I think that's what that's what I was trying to get at. But that question, which I don't think I really addressed, there was a question in the chat about forgetting, and actually the point that you've just made there, Lola, you know, really connects to that, which is that actually we're really forgetting most stuff most of the time. You know, there's just too much stuff out there to remember, so we're actually forgetting most of it. So the stuff that we point our nostalgic antennas towards is always, you know, we always have our particular agendas, I think, to do that, you know, to try and rescue from that growing heap of culture, you know, that which we want to retain for ourselves and revisit.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Can we all please clap and say thank you to Richard for a really, really wonderful keynote lecture. I'll go myself. And then perhaps I can ask all, thank you, Richard. And can I ask presenters to turn camera and microphones on and share any concluding thoughts? While you turn the cameras on, I'll say a few things I've jotted down during these days. For me, one of the things I was thinking about was during these 3 afternoons, first of all, I hadn't quite made the connection that was so clear when you explained it, Richard, about ambient music and longing. And I was thinking, what kind of longing is it? Is it a longing for displacement itself, of a longing for no place? And along those lines, I was trying to come up with an antonym, because we've heard about synonyms. We know about nostalmania, we know about retromania, and so on. But what is the opposite of nostalgia? And speaking of untranslatable words, which is a recurrent cliche that comes about often when we talk about nostalgia. It's a universal emotion, but we like to think that it's exclusive to our culture. There is one word that I do think it's untranslatable, which is quite probably maybe an antonym to nostalgia, which is the French word of dépaysement, which, like nostalgia, it's twofold. It can be that feeling of not feeling comfortable because we don't feel at home, and that's the negative aspect of it. But it also has the positive aspect of something we look forward to. We go abroad or to a place we've never been to before, precisely looking for that feeling of the country of déjà vu, of arriving somewhere and saying, well, I've never been here. I don't know what this is about. This is totally new. So perhaps that's one of the antonyms that we can find for nostalgia. It's the dépaysement. And then the other thing that so the call for papers did not explicitly cater for popular music or for popular song. And yet the vast majority of what we've heard about these days is popular music. And so I was thinking that perhaps there is a highbrow, lowbrow hierarchy of emotions, and that perhaps nostalgia, as it is a sentimental, emotional feeling, is lower on the hierarchy of emotions. It's not the most noble of emotions, not believed to be. But there has been discussion about the middle class. I remember Indiana Abani's paper about the middle class as having the key to modernization and being the class that manages, or not manages, what's the right word here, but that has the keys to the discourse and the dominating discourse about cosmopolitanism or reactionary politics, etc. So perhaps that's a topic for a future conference, the question of nostalgia and class, the same way that race and gender have popped up here and there, but there hasn't been a solid paper addressing those things. But we've heard about ethnic background in Manuel Bocquier's paper, well, in lots of them, and also with gender. And the other question is the issue of cultural hegemony. I think that's how you pronounced, right? Hegemony. Hope that's right. Which was very poignant in Cecilia's paper about where we go to looking for expressions of national identity, and that leaves out other regional aspects. So nostalgia and nationalism, of course, is a beaten up subject, well-known road, but I think there's so much more to talk about. And well, I've got lots of other notes, but I'm sure and I hope we'll have time to discuss them further. Now I would like to open it up to all speakers and attendees. Like I said before, if you want to be put on microphone or camera, ask me and I'll do that. But can we please hear from the rest of the speakers and attendees? Esteban?
Well, I might like to say a word about what you just said, the highbrow, lowbrow thing. I think there is a contingency there, because I could imagine, I mean, whole conferences on Wagner and nostalgia for one thing, and the whole mechanics of Wagnerian music being as a machine to produce nostalgia, and how that was applied as, I mean, in so many other levels in Hollywood music and film music. So I wouldn't go that far as to say that nostalgia, maybe there is a class work distribution of emotional tasks in which you are basically correct in saying that nostalgia, the work of nostalgia is related to some kind of mass-producing genres, mass-produced genres. But Wagner is definitely a strong counter-example to that notion. So I'm looking forward to have more people talking about nostalgia and classical and opera as well. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Wagner was the example that came up more in the books about the subject, but it's typically sentimentalism in popular song that gets talked about, discussed more often.
Maybe I can say something, but it's, I mean, it's such a huge topic, and it's been sort of so many thoughts in the air, and it's a really fascinating discussion. And I'm not sure sort of what we can take up in the last couple of minutes of the conference. But I think that there's sort of, overall, there could be more sort of analytical, or how to say, in Germany we say Begriffsarbeit. So it's the work on the notions and the concepts. Because, for instance, in German, there are the two notions of Heimweh and Fernweh, which are sort of symmetrical. So it's the longing for it's the homesickness and the longing for places somewhere, to travel somewhere else. And interestingly, Heimweh is also translated as nostalgia, whereas Fernweh is always it's not translated as nostalgia, but it's always something, it's a longing for some place else. And I was thinking about that during the talk, during Richard's talk with the postcards, because the Fernweh, sort of the longing to be someplace else, usually is not, or would in that German English translation would not be translated as nostalgia, but it can only be nostalgic for places you have already been, I guess. Or sort of to put it in the form of a question, is every kind of longing necessarily nostalgic, or what is the specificity of nostalgia compared to other kinds of longing, of sentimentality, and of sadness, basically, because some of the things that we talked about are these other kinds of emotions.
Thank you. There is, so John van der Weert says, I have a point from a younger perspective. So that sounds intriguing.
Is this working? Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, hello. So you briefly talked about this towards the end. Oh, no. Okay. So you briefly talked about this towards the end. But this idea of how we don't have time to be nostalgic is quite interesting to me, just coming from a generation a little bit younger. I mean that very respectfully, but coming from a younger generation that, you know, grew up with YouTube, grew up with instant messaging where you could listen to anything that you wanted to at any time. It feels as if, you know, to be nostalgic means to waste time, to not be living in the moment, quote unquote. You know, you hear from quite a few people, you know, you should live in the moment. You shouldn't dwell in the past. You should let it be the past. And so it's this contingency behind, you know, allowing yourself to dwell and to ruminate about the past and to learn from the past, but to simultaneously live in the future and think about the future, but then also live in the moment. And I just find that interesting if there's any observations about, you know, how the pace of modern life in relation to music and creation of music and consumption.
Mm-hmm. Richard, yes, please.
Only just a very brief point on that. That I think it's interesting to think about music as a temporal form in this respect, and to think about you know, the time it takes to make and play and listen to music. I think especially when, you know, we think about live music, which we can't sort of skip through and fast forward in the same way that we can with recorded music. There's some interesting comments which I in fact was originally going to include as part of my talk. Some comments, and in fact I believe my abstract mentioned something about spending resources, but it was something I couldn't fit in the end, unfortunately. But there's some interesting points that Jacques Attali makes in his book Noise about, you know, the spending, music being a kind, and time being a resource that's associated with music, both in terms of music's unfolding, but also in terms of, you know, the time that we spend listening to it. The time, he's particularly referring here to, you know, sound recordings as commodities as well. So the time that we spend earning money to go and spend money on those sound recordings, which, assuming we buy them, that is, which we then spend more time on. So he talks about this in terms of kind of this proliferation of resources connected to music, and I think that that's quite interesting in terms of your point, John. And I think that yeah, that idea as well of just, you know, having access to everything, it's I don't know, I mean, what do you think about that? Because I mean, is that something that also brings a sense of anxiety, that that, you know, there is just no one can ever, you know, listen to everything, no one can ever access everything, and so therefore, you know, there's that sense in which we need curators. And one of the reasons I wanted to include the Spotify playlists as an example, at least a passing example in my talk, is that way in which, you know, you have this seemingly endless archive like Spotify, but there's still this need felt to, you know, slice it up, categorize it, put it into, you know, curated categories, one of which, of course, is related to travel, and others are related to mood and nostalgia and what have you as well. So I'm not sure that I'm really answering your point, but...
No, yeah, you did. That was great. Yeah, I do research on Russian hip-hop and rap. And so it's just very interesting to see this kind of dilemma, I guess, in the Russian sphere, is that you know, people are so trying to escape the Soviet Union that they don't want to be nostalgic, because to be nostalgic is to, in a way, support their history that they're trying so very hard to forget. And so I find it really interesting. A lot of these, you know, alternative forms of music are trying to rebel against the past, but then comment on the present and look towards the future. But as they're doing that, you know, there's this juxtaposition between they don't want to repeat the past, but they need to learn from the past. So they need to ruminate about the past. And so it's just very interesting to see how people use the past, but they also rebel against it. So
I think I'd love to know more about Russian hip hop and nostalgia. And I was thinking that for future events or for any output that might come out of this event, Russia is a really important place to cover. So perhaps in a future event, there could be a paper about Russian hip hop. And then what you said about Attali, if I remember correctly, it's the idea that silence would be a privilege of the rich. No, I think that's what he wrote. And perhaps now what John was saying about young people not having time for nostalgia, perhaps his generation would say nostalgia is a privilege of the leisurely, of those who've got time, while the not even millennials, but younger than millennials are doing 5 jobs a week. And
I completely agree.
well, then a note about Paris. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you arrive in Charles de Gaulle Airport, there is a sign where there are a couple who say Paris vous aime, Paris loves you. And every time I go past one of those in the tapis roulant, I think that's such a lie. Paris only loves itself. It's the most narcissistic of cities. And we've seen how nostalgia in Paris, or at least the kinds of nostalgia in Paris with or about Paris, is precisely about Paris. Whereas in other examples, like in Prague or like in Beirut, there is this distant home, which isn't even local. Like in Beirut, would hear about how that ideal, distant idea was Japan. In Prague, it was the rural areas. In the US, it was the South regions. But in Paris, it's Paris itself. So I'd be really interested in the future to hear about nostalgia that isn't exoticism of foreign countries, which happened in Paris for other parts of France.
Yeah, Lola, to your point, sort of the inverse is true of New York. If Paris loves you, then the slogan for New York is "I love New York," sort of implying that, you know, New York is all about different stories and different individuals. But I don't know. It seems like we should be talking about some kind of urban nostalgia musical studies as a sort of sub-discipline, something that deals with some of these issues of canonicity, which I think explains partially why there's this focus of popular music. I think that a lot of us relied implicitly on reception history in order to understand what nostalgia meant as an act of labor. What does it take for somebody to have to express nostalgia, but also nostalgia as a commodity? What are these things that are being put out there in order to satisfy a nostalgia market? So there are several sort of issues here, and with regards to the urban of the conference theme, I'm thinking of, you know, Kevin Lynch's concept of image of the city, how citizens mapped their own urban environments, kind of not only in a psychogeographical way, but actually in the way that the city is being projected outwards. And in this case, in the form of sound, either through sound clips, as Richard's talk pointed out, or through imaginative scores with all of the images and paratexts that are packaged in with the nostalgic pieces of sheet music that we've explored. So there are many different intersections here between visual cultural studies, sound studies, obviously urban studies, but also an element of kind of a Marxian materialist history about how nostalgia exists as a thing, as a product of human labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, then, if there are no further comments, then I only need to thank you all, congratulate you all for presenting your work in these challenging situations and conditions. In a musical analogy, it's been, you could say, a punk DIY style, or even more appropriate would be a garage rock, in that the conference has been done from home, far away from any university or institution which have been closed down. So it's been a very DIY project. But I hope you've gained something from the event, that you've learned, that you've discovered not only new music and new cultural references, but hopefully the work of new people that you may want to be in touch with from now on. It's going to be quite a task to do, because there were, I think, almost 170 people registered, but I will I think manually. I don't think there's a way to do that. If anybody knows, please let me know if I can download automatically. Otherwise, I'll manually copy everybody's address, and I promise to be in touch and send the links I have received of music. I will actually copy the chat right now, save it, so that we have Richard's links. So yes, like I was saying, I'll be in touch. Just a reminder that I really wish to thank the CRAL and the EHESS for their support. And of course, above all, I should thank all of you for presenting, our wonderful scientific committee and Keynote for sharing their work and thinking together about nostalgia. Then I'm afraid all things have to end. Even the best of things have to end, and we'll have to close the session and say à bientôt. I'm seeing, okay, there's a comment from Garcia now. This about displacement, slavery, genocide. The timbre of nostalgia can be very different. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. So there is certainly lots of new fields to explore in the future. I think if we can just do one last sonic experiment, let's all turn our microphones on and let's give each other a clap.
Bravo! Thank you, Lola.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bravo to all of you. Thank you. It's been really, really wonderful, and I look forward to hearing from you. If you've got any comments, please write to the music.cities.2020@gmail.com email address. I'll be really delighted to hear from you all. And yeah, this is like when you don't really want to hang up a phone call, but you have to. So I'm sorry, I will have to click on the end session for all. I don't mean to do it, but we have to do it. Okay, be safe, take care of yourselves.
Thanks very much,
everyone around you.
Bye. Really great.
Bye.
And thank you. Congratulations.
Bye.
Congratulations, and see you soon. Bye.